now take you to the broadcast of It's Time with Rev Nathaniel W Martin. Here's Reverend Martin.
Thank you, Dr. Blackwell, and let me say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, certainly never good night and never goodbye. My name is Pastor Nathaniel Wayne Martin. I'm the pastor of the New Life Institutional Baptist Church here in Los Angeles. I'm located at 8916 South Main Street, and we are sharing the building with the Shiloh Missionary Christian Church. My good friend, Dr. Della F. Holliness is the pastor there. And you want to get a double dose of the Holy Ghost, then you need to come and worship with me, worship with us, and you will never be the same again. We guarantee it. We thank God. This Sunday we're going to have a little baptizing at the morning worship. Brother Rion and little brother Isaiah will be getting baptized, and so we're looking forward to that. But enough of that. Our purpose here is to talk about this offering, and the name of this offering is entitled, It's Time. And what is it time for? It is time for justice, and that includes environmental justice, social justice, and it must always include economic justice, and economic justice must always bring us to the question of reparations. You may have noticed that on Fox News they had some little fellow making a nuisance and harassing the politicians in a most ghastly way in order to get the response he wanted, which was a negative response on reparations. And I saw him proudly seated in a suit later on Fox News, happy at his disturbance that he had caused in the political campaign among the Democrats. But the purpose of reparation is to redress the indignities and the criminal wrongs done by those who call themselves white against those whom they said were black. Since we know that neither black nor white occurs in nature or in biology or in the DNA helix, then we know that racism, therefore, is a social construct. It is a political stratagem that has really been imposed as a psychologist. As you learn in Psychology 101, it's a concept that was imposed by someone else upon the society. And we have lived with this lie for over 400 years here in the land that we call America, here on in the Western Hemisphere, on the North American continent, which we share, I remind you, with other countries. And as a result, we are laboring, we being the collective social construct, social order, is laboring to overcome the legacy and the vestiges and the consequences and the results and the effects and the harm caused by that lie of racism. And most of us are having a hard time. We're looking at something on TV now that said that doctors coming out of med school still think that black people have a thicker skin than white people. Hallelujah. No wonder we have such bad outcomes when we go to see the doctor. Before we begin or continue, it looks like I've already got started, let me read our historical scripture on reparation, Deuteronomy chapter 15, beginning at verse number 12. Two verses of that we will read in your hearing, those of you that have heard it before. And if thy brother, God talking, an Hebrew man or an Hebrew woman be sold unto thee and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year, how long? In the 7th year, thou shalt let him or her go free from thee. And this is the clincher. This binds humanity together. And when thou sendest them out free from thee, thou shalt not let them go away empty. In other words, you're not to just discard them like a Kleenex or worse, like human offal or flotsam and jetsam upon the land. But you are to supply them is one word that comes to mind. You are to supply them. You're not going to make them rich, but you're going to supply them with the need. God says in verse number 14, thou shalt furnish him or her, remember, liberally. The conservatives hate that word liberal right now because it's in the Bible. It says you got to furnish them liberally out of thy flock and out of thy floor and out of thy winepress and of that wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give unto him/her. And so we are brothers and sisters. We are a family. And in families, things happen. But we are never to turn our backs, according to the Lord, here on our brothers and our sisters. Notice God says, if a Hebrew man or a if thy brother, a Hebrew man, or if by implication thy sister, an Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee and serve thee 6 years. And I always like to make the aside that God said that slavery was not to be perpetual, and it was not to be a stigma, and it neither was it to be an inheritance. We were not to inherit slavery, whereas in the United States, in the 13 colonies, starting at Jamestown, rather, they sought to stamp slavery as a genetic marker, as a DNA upon the people whom they had stolen away from the continent of Africa, whom they had kidnapped in most cases. People tried to make a big story as though it justifies or cleanses their hands that the people whom they took as slaves were sold to them by the African chieftains. But the point is that the African chieftains did not have an inkling of what this European slaveholder was planning to do with the people that they captured. Because African slavery on the African continent was, quite different. A man kept his family, kept his identity, kept his name, kept his religion, and he could rise like Joseph rising up in the land that the Greeks renamed Egypt, knowing, of course, that Egypt, the land that the Greeks called Egypt, was really a part of Africa. And that's another story, of course, but the Greeks spent most of that time down in the libraries and the tombs of the Africans and the Theban Book of the Dead and all of those things. And most of the pantheon that the Greeks are given credit for today were not theirs. They were the pantheon of the people that they call the Egyptians, which were really the black people. You had the higher Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. That's another story for another day. Suffice it to say for us that we must continue to press the claim for reparations here in this nation, here in this country. As Abraham Lincoln said, the American slavery, because both North and South were responsible. The people up North were getting rich off of the people down South, because the people up North insured the slave ships, insured the cargo. They made the chains and the coffles and the clothing. The British bought the cotton that the slaves picked, and the whole chain of commerce, whole deadly, dastardly chain of economic commerce from the cotton fields of Mississippi and North and South and tobacco fields of North Carolina that wound up on the tables as fine linen and good cigars in the the luxury apartments and palaces of the Europeans came from the fields of naturally America, from the hands of those who picked the cotton, who did not willingly pick the cotton, but who were compelled under duress and under stress and under extortion to labor freely, free toil, free labor. And since they did not pay the slaves when the Emancipation Proclamation was announced and when the Civil War finally ended, they did not pay the slaves, but they paid the slave trader and the slave owner and the slave masters, if you will. That bill is yet due for those 250 years of unrequited toil, as Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, so eloquently expressed it in the his second inaugural. Some people ask, why do you always quote Abraham Lincoln? Because Abraham Lincoln wrote his own speeches. These other fellows, they don't write their speeches. They're reading off a teleprompter. But Abe Lincoln actually pondered and thought and meditated on his speeches, and that's why his speeches have such lasting elegance and such poetic impact and such a grab you so viscerally, because he actually gave thought to what he was going to address to the American public. And that is why we always quote so much from Abe Lincoln. Plus, I've made a study of Abe Lincoln and a research of Abe Lincoln, because he was known as a great emancipator, and since I and my people were the ones that were emancipated, I found it necessary to know about that time in which the Emancipation Proclamation came forth. What were the circumstances before it, and what circumstances that led to it, and what were the circumstances subsequent to it, the pros and the cons, the good and the bad. Because as Ta-Nehisi Coates said, you become a journalist, a reporter. You have to be honest and as objective as God will let you be when you're looking at your own people and the history and the record of how your people, both sides of your people, remember, you're on the side of the slave, and you're also implicated in the side of the slave master. So which puts the so-called people who are black, who are descendants of the former slaves, in a very strange and awkward position. You are of what W.B. Du Bois called a double consciousness. And I don't think that sense of double consciousness will ever go away. I notice our younger generations seem to be disconnected from that history, or from us rather, and seem to be oblivious. But hey, they can do it. As long as they can do it, let them do it. But I'm sure that reality is going to come, exploding forth in their lives sooner or later, and they too will have to begin to take up this mantle of the need to go back over our social and political history as it has been experienced in these United States of America. I want to call your attention to a project now by the New York Times. I'm going to read a bit of it. It's called the 1619 Project. Starts out by saying, I'm reading off the cell phone. I'm reading off the New York Times page itself. It says, in the August of 1619, a ship appeared on this horizon near Point Comfort, a coastal port in the British colony of Virginia. It carried more than 20 enslaved Africans who were sold to the colonists. Notice this point. No aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed. Let me say that again. no aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the years of slavery that followed. That's impact right there. On the 400th anniversary of this fateful moment, it is finally time to tell our story truthfully. That's from the New York Times. Now, you know the New York Times is a very conservative tome, publication. If you go back and search its history, you will be surprised at the position that it took on slavery, at the position that it took on so-called Negroes after slavery, and it is the position that the New York Times took on segregation and Jim Crow and the housing, and on school education, and on busing, and on the prison industrial complex. Don't forget that New York was a slave state. It was the guy who founded New York, last name was Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant was a slave owner, a slave holder. So what do you think? You think he was against slavery? No, he was pro-slavery. New York was pro-slavery. Slaves escaping from other slave states into New York were not any better off when they got to New York than they were when they were back in the openly blatant slave states. Don't ever forget that New York had auction blocks and slave pens and the whole milieu and panoply and all of the arrangements and apparatus of slave selling and slave auctioning, and slaves were sold on the stock exchange right there in New York, as well as in, of course, Washington, D.C. So New York never has been any great place or plateau of freedom. I need to put that out there, because a lot of us have, I even had the wrong concept and idea about New York. There were, thank God, there were some people in the state of New York who were abolitionists, thank God, but the bulk of the populace was not abolitionists. And so don't ever get the idea that when you got to New York, you were in some panacea of liberty or freedom or justice. No, quite to the contrary. They had terrible laws against black people, black codes in the city of New York. Don't forget that in 1863, following, in January, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect, but that when Lincoln issued a draft, a call for the draft for soldiers to fight in the Union Army to overcome or to suppress or to defeat the rebels or the Confederates, that the Irish community there in New York rose up en masse and lynched and burned for 3 days. You talk about black people having a riot. What about these white folks had a riot? They lynched and burned Negroes all over the city of New York. You read that history, it is a very dismaying, but it's at the same time eye-opening how our people were mistreated by the Irish. And when you hear people talking about their Irish identity, remember the Irish were very brutal and inhumane in their contact with the so-called people who were called black. Even though they might have been freed people, free or born free, they still were subject to all of the terror and the criminality and all of the evil vicissitudes that could be visited by one human upon another human right there in New York. And of course, as I said, the Irish took the lead in that brutalization of the freed slaves or the freed people who were of a darker hue, as we say, on the warmth of other suns. And that must always be noted. Of course, the Irish were not considered white. That's another point. When they were brought here, they were not considered white by the white people, the people who considered themselves white here in America. So it took a while, but with the Irish joining in with the colonists and the people, the civilization, rather, society, in repressing, suppressing black people, then it took a while, but after a while, they began to be regarded as, wouldn't you know it, white people, whereas we, black people, have not become white yet, in as much as white is a social construct and is a, what's the other word, a political strata. Black people have not become white yet, but the Irish have become white, and a lot of Mexicans today are laboring to become white. People from Honduras and Nicaragua and El Salvador and all around those areas, and Mexico, and people from Belize, people from Haiti, people from Cuba, people from the continent of Africa who talk with that African accent. A lot of the inflection, a lot of them are, according to the United States Census, being allowed to check the box as white, which further causes confusion among those of us who were born here in this country, and our generations go back into antiquity. With these recent immigrant arrivals who feel no fealty or fellowship with their darker-hued brothers and sisters who were born here. Remember that in the country of Brazil, that they have 200 varieties, different shades of race there. Whereas I'm black here, if I went to Brazil, I might be called a white man. If you went home to the continent of Africa, went to Ethiopia or any of those countries, Ghana, Senegal, anywhere around there, the problem of your racial or ethnic identity would hit you in the face. Yes, you would be recognized as an American, but you may not necessarily be recognized as black, because they got some folk there that are black. And but yet some of those folk that you would recognize as black look upon themselves as white, because, as you say, racism is amorphous, and it is malleable, and it is flexible. It changes form to suit its own advantage in each and every country, in each and every situation or condition. Just like the Irish became white, here you have someone blacker than me who is considered, who is rather accepted as white by those in power. And so as long as this, shall we say, this philosophy of whiteness, this doctrine, damnable though it may be, of white supremacy is still extant in our world as well as in our country, then of course you can obviously see that we who have always historically in this country been viewed as second class or fourth class these days. We must fight, we must ask, we must demand, we must draw attention to the need for reparations. When you look at the wealth gap, that's a 250-year head start on wealth that the so-called white people had over the so-called black people. All right, we get down to the 5-minute mark. Let us draw some conclusions. This fight will not be won in my lifetime. But it is good to hear the political candidates talk about reparation, began to mention or mouth or say reparation. Is even good, although they speak it in a intent or with an intent to undermine the cause of reparations. At least we are getting a conversation going about reparations in these United States of America. This conversation must continue. Malcolm X talked about how the Negro has been sociologically exploited and subjected here in this country. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is one of the editors there at the Atlantic Monthly or the Atlantic Magazine, and who has written many essays, The Case for Reparations being one of them, and then he has written several books. One of it wrote to his son called Between the World and Me, which I encourage all of you to get a copy of that book, Between the World and Me. And then with the other book, We Were 8 Years in Power. I encourage you to get those books. But don't keep up with this, please do keep up with this New York Times, project, 1619 project. This is the 400th year slavery entered into the 13 colonies in 1619 on a little ship called the White Lion, and this is 400 years now, from 1619 to 2019. You can count, and so we're in the 400th year of that devastation, of that dark night that has benighted the minds and the conscience and the intelligence of the entire world. We're all suffering from cognitive dissonance, but thank God some of us are waking up, and I encourage all of us to wake up and fight back and speak up and recognize that nature did not lie, that politics is not nature, and nature is not politics. And so what men have sought to impose upon the world and upon other men, upon other women, boys and girls, with the educational system and with the medical system and with the housing discrimination and all of that, that you and I have an obligation to fight back and to reveal the truth and speak up for the truth. Even if it causes you to lose your life, you need to tell the truth. As I wrap up, as I'm using my preaching voice, as I close, remember that in this nation, in this country, where we are vendors, or where we are independent contractors, or where we are contracting to work for other people, listen. If you're working on a job and they're cutting your hours and they don't want to give you no kind of benefits and all that kind of stuff, listen, if they don't want to pay you, do what the man said in the job, go in there and tell them to take this job and shove it. Or at the least, tell them what Rev Martin told you. If you don't want to pay me, I ain't going to work for you. God bless you. Thank you so much. May God keep you.
And nothing stands over. My good days, all of my good days, outweigh my bad days, yes they do. Outweigh my bad days. I just say thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. I won't complain. Complain.